Hello, everyone. My name is Harshu, and welcome to the session today on a new way to leverage purely selfish behavior to control pandemics, Network Radar. I'm very excited today to introduce you to Dr. Po-Shen Loh. Loh is a social entrepreneur working across the spectrum of mathematics, education, and healthcare all around the world. He's the founder of a free personalized learning platform, xpi.com, a social enterprise supported by his series of online math courses that reinvent the middle school math curriculum with a focus on creative thinking. He's also a math professor at Carnegie Mellon University and the national coach of the USA International Mathematical Olympiad team. Upon the outbreak of COVID-19, he turned his mathematical attention to create NOVID, the world's first app to introduce the fundamentally different network radar paradigm for pandemic control. Today, Dr. Loh will be discussing how NOVID's network-based approach can help people fight pandemics. We invite you to use the swap card platform during the session. On the right-hand side, feel free to share your thoughts on the live discussion board and leave and upvote any questions for our speaker to answer during or at the end of the presentation. And after the session, we invite you to use SwapCard to set up meetings with your fellow conference attendees. Dr. Loh will also be available on GatherTown for half an hour or so after his presentation to answer any lingering questions that we weren't able to get to. So please join in virtually to continue the conversation. And without further ado, Dr. Loh.
Wow, well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to everyone here. I'm just a mathematician, actually, who accidentally found myself in this world of trying to think about how to fight disease. But then accidents are interesting. We accidentally found a new way to fight disease. And I'm very excited to be able to share this with you because it's a very practical thing that can be done that will help not only the current pandemic, but could potentially help in all future pandemics as well. Well, how does this work? The key is, as I said, I'm a mathematician. What are we good for? Well, one of the things that mathematicians sometimes think about is game theory or network theory or all of these things. And once you think about that, then you start to think, is there any other way that we could be trying to coordinate the behavior problem that we have with the pandemic? Because you see, I'm actually emphasizing the key here is we need to find a natural way to align with human instincts because controlling a pandemic is not only a pharmaceutical problem. In fact, actually, if I go back and I think, how do these pandemics spread? They spread by people who are sick spreading them. And you can think about how one of the core techniques that we've used as a human civilization to control pandemics for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, it's based on a concept that doesn't exactly align with human interests. Now, the problem with bringing a mathematician into the room is the mathematician might want to draw stuff. So that's what I'm going to do next. But that's the easiest way that I can try to communicate what we're doing. So the way that people have controlled disease for the longest time is that you find the person who's sick. And if you have the person who's sick, then you go and try to find the people that they've been around. And then you attempt to remove all of them from society against their will. Now, the issue with this sort of a concept is, first of all, I've said it extremely bluntly because we're doing game theory. We're thinking about what might happen. But when you try to tell people to be removed against their will because they are potentially dangerous to everybody else, well, humans are sometimes selfish and they sometimes cheat. And unfortunately, what we're seeing here is the premise of every Hollywood movie about zombies, which is why the zombie virus keeps spreading and spreading. But our idea was actually very simple. The simple concept was, well, these people, they're actually part of a larger network. And the larger network might be complicated. Maybe you've got some people connected to some other people, like so. I'm just making up something. But at some point, there's you. And our idea is actually totally trivial. It is just that, what if you just told everybody how many steps away they were from the pandemic? How many steps away they are from the disease? 1, 2, 3. In this particular case, this is that the disease is 3 steps away. And the way that we interpret these edges, these connections, are that they spend lots, well, let's just say significant time together. That's what one of these connections means. And so the simple idea would be, what if you just told everybody how many steps away the disease was? What good could that do for you? Well, that's where this all started. Now, we found out that doing that one tiny change had some interesting impacts. Because, for example, then you could actually show someone how far away a disease was from them in a visual form, animated visual form, something like this. So you could, for example, plot as time is changing, how many instances of the disease there are, and how far away that is from you in terms of the number of relationships on this network. Let me just play that again. And again, the height of a bar is how many cases of the disease there are. And the degree of connection, that's the degree of separation that it is from you. So for example, this would be a picture saying that you spend time with someone who spends time with a second person, who spends time with a third person, who spends time with a fourth person, and that fourth person got sick. What can you do with this? Well, it turns out that we did this just actually, we just made this display at the time, and we weren't really sure what this would be good for other than it was interesting. But after a few months, we realized that what we were staring at was perhaps the first tool that had ever been deployed in human history that you can use to see a disease striking from far away on the interaction network before it gets to you. And then that does some very interesting things to the game theory. For example, here's, for example, 2 shots of this kind of a pandemic radar. This is a pandemic network radar. And I see that we have some interesting questions about things like adoption. I'll be getting to that. I'm first starting with what is the core concept? And the core concept was very simple. Just report to each person how many steps away the disease has been striking from them. But then that's actually useful. Because if you find out that the disease got within 3 relationships of you, you have a few things that you could do. For example, if it got within 3 relationships, perhaps you might want to wear a better mask. Like the cloth masks, those are very good for protecting other people from me. They're not as good at protecting me from other people. So I might want to upgrade. For example, if I'm going to go somewhere, I'm actually traveling in a week, I'm actually going to want to protect myself from other people. I'll be doing double mask because that's better at protecting me. I'm basically indicating that sometimes you might want to raise your shields. And this information about diseases within distance 3, now that could be a way to let you know to raise shields, increasing distancing, avoiding unnecessary social gatherings. I can tell you a story because this has been deployed at a few universities. One of these universities, a student sent us a thank you saying, thanks for this app, because I was able to decide not to hang out with a particular friend. We both had checked our apps. They weren't together yet. They both checked their apps. He found out that he was 2 relationships away from a disease. His friend checked, found out he was within 1 relationship from the disease. And the 2 of them just decided, maybe let's not hang out today. And with these very small changes that you can do in your life, they actually can help improve your chance of not getting sick. And that was the thanks he gave me. Because if you think about it, it's really hard to have lunch with your friend with masks on. And so the main point of this was we can't live in a world where everyone takes maximum precaution for over 1 year. You need to have some automatic way of modulating this. And so what we did is we then went and, I see questions are appearing about how we did this. Well, we went and implemented this. Actually, this is an app. It's on smartphones. We went and built a system where smartphones are able to talk to each other, automatically exchange anonymized information that says my user ID is blah, 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 which has nothing to do with anything about them personally. But then this is able to automatically construct a large-scale network automatically, just as the apps are on people's phones, and the phones are just talking to each other. So we'll have a lot of interesting questions to answer during the Q&A. But the big point here is that what we have just done is we've made a way for which it's not social networks, it's just like physical, these 2 devices were around each other with no names attached. But this actually gives you an incentive in the sense that it's actually an app that you could use to be able to see something coming before it gets to you. And because what we care about is not COVID, we actually care about the future pandemics, things that are possibly much worse. I'm going to go back to this one, which is this animation I was showing. And let's think of a thought experiment. Pretend that what happened was that there was a new hemorrhagic fever, something like Ebola, where very high fatality rate, and as you die, you bleed out of your eyeballs. It's disgusting. It's awful. If Ebola was coming, what fraction of people would want to have an app that lets them see if Ebola is coming before it gets to them? Actually, we did a lot of asking informally, and a lot of people would want to know if a very dangerous disease was coming before it got to them. Whereas if you ask people, and the other thing is you ask people if they saw that this dangerous disease was getting close, what would they do? A lot of them said that they would be very afraid and want to stay home. This actually drives another way to separate the people who are potentially sick and the people who are not. Actually, if I go back to this picture, effectively all we've done mathematically is that we have two sets. These two sets. We're trying to separate these two sets. And if you think about it, for the entirety of history, the way that these two sets were separated was by finding the people in this set and attempting to remove them from society, often against their will. Our idea was that you can separate two sets by letting this set keep their distance. And that is actually made possible through smartphones. So a few brief things about the theory here, just because I see a lot of very robust questions that we might want to talk about. Oh, let me hit this one right away, which is about somebody asking about degrees of separation. Well, it's a common misunderstanding. Our app is not designed to be just keeping track of the degrees of separation of the other person. Actually, that's not relevant for disease transmission. So the phenomenon of 6 degrees of separation is actually not relevant, because that one you've heard of is based on if you just know the other person. Whereas our system requires that you're around them. So for example, the distance from me to the organizers of this conference is not 1 or 2 degrees of separation, which is what it is in terms of who I know, but it's probably in the hundreds in terms of the physical separations that are required, maybe even 1,000. Okay, so now why is this a big deal? So the first thing is, actually, this unlocks a totally new mechanism for controlling diseases. And if with what we've seen from the previous speakers, look, we have dangers that are out there. My angle is to come at things and say, we have dangers. Can we set up feedback loops, automatic feedback loops in society and human behavior, which cause even purely selfish behavior to drive towards a common goal? That's actually, I mean, whether we like it or not, that's at the heart of free market capitalism, the free market economy. And this thing would bring the same kinds of concepts towards pandemic control in a way that was never there before. So that if you have something dangerous emerging, at least everyone trying to be selfishly protecting themselves might cause the whole thing to slow down in spreading. As one point of reference, if you think about how we're handling COVID, once there are only a few cases in the city, then the city tries to open up because it has to. And then those few cases multiply until it's too many. Then you have to lock down again. And then it opens up again after a few cases. You guarantee there's always cases. With this approach, even if there are only 10 cases in San Francisco, well, you could potentially have that. Yes, there's 10 cases in San Francisco. Most people run around, do their thing. But there's 100 people who realize that those 10 cases are pretty close, or maybe a couple hundred. And that awareness and that inspiration of some extra caution could actually be what could help you let that number of cases actually converge towards zero. A few comments on why this is actually a potentially interesting deal. Coming again from the mathematics, if I think about behavioral science, Nash equilibrium. So this is where we think about human behavior. A Nash equilibrium is where a lot of people have chosen their behaviors, and somehow nobody benefits from changing their behavior. Nobody benefits selfishly from individually changing their behavior. And the very interesting thing here is that if you look at this new innovation, this new approach actually is selfishly beneficial for you. So it has 2 Nash equilibria. One of our Nash equilibria is where everybody installs the app. Of course, one of them is where nobody does. Let me go straight into contrast with the standard. If you look at the traditional contact tracing app, those are all over the world. That was a big cottage industry for a while, and then Apple and Google made something. But the contact tracing app that many people have does the following. It will tell you after you've already been around somebody who has the disease, and they'll ask you to please voluntarily self-quarantine to protect everybody else from you. So the point is, with what has been made before, those are all tools designed to protect everybody else against you who installed the app. Therefore, actually, the only Nash equilibrium that those apps have is that nobody has the app installed. For us, it's actually both. We have everyone as one of the attractors. And to put this into contrast, imagine the following hypothetical situation for the old-fashioned app. If everybody except you had it installed, would you want to install it if you were selfish, thinking selfishly? Your act of installing it would not do anything to your own chance of getting sick, but it would let you quarantine to protect everybody else if you were around somebody who is sick. That doesn't actually give you much incentive to install it. In fact, the more people who have it installed, possibly the less you have a selfish instinct to install it. But if you think about what happens in our situation, imagine that everybody except you had the app installed, and therefore if you installed it, it would never tell you to quarantine, but it would tell you robustly of this huge radar network of everyone else is in it, and you get to see if disease is coming. Actually, the more other people have it, the more you want it. And that's the interesting thing about using the human behavior and the game theory, we actually found a way to make an attractor point in this state space of behaviors. Now, some more practical things. It actually has some major additional benefits as well, 3 orders of magnitude, which are worth paying attention to, especially as we think about the next pandemic. The first one, we have now learned from the standard contact tracing app phenomenon that there's actually a fundamental inconsistency in the sense that the apps that you've heard of, those are ones that anonymously ask you to quarantine. But unfortunately, it's now also known that if 2 people are around each other, one of them with COVID, if it's 6 feet, 30 minutes even, no masks indoors, the chance of transmission is about 10% or less. Now, the danger there is that if you think about it, if you try to be anonymous, make an anonymous app asking people to please quarantine, if they're asking people to quarantine and when they send that signal means you have a 10% chance of being sick. Please now with that 10% chance of being sick, protect other people from you. That's tough. And so that's why what we want to do is we want to flip that incentive from protecting others to protecting yourself. And that gives you a major gain. Another major gain. This is also interesting. This is some network theory thing. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't enter if they're positive. Okay, that is actually one point of altruism that our system needs. And because we care about privacy, the only way we ever know someone's positive or around someone positive is that they enter it voluntarily into the system. But now, it is true that some people are altruistic. Obviously, there's some people at this conference. But we estimate that 10 to 20% of people actually will enter something into their app. And what we do, which is different from everyone else, is in ours, you can also tell the app, I wasn't positive, but I was around somebody who was positive as validated by a contact tracer. Now, in the other system, that's useless. You never quarantine a contact of a contact. But in our system, it's really useful because of the triangle inequality from graph theory. I can say it in normal language like this. If you found out that 2 relationships from you, there's somebody who's a direct contact of a sick person, guess what? There's a sick person within 3 of you. The triangle inequality says that if there's like 2 relationships away to get to someone, and that person is 1 away from a sick person, then within 3 of you, there's a sick person, which is just as useful for our system. So this actually increases the input signal by an entire order of magnitude because we can get input both from sick people and from people who are around them. I'm just talking fast because I'm trying to wrap up the main thing. And so somehow also the other thing is people often say, well, what's the use of these apps? All these asymptomatics and untested positives. And my answer is usually that's exactly why this is useful. Because with this system, if you have asymptomatics and untested positives, which will happen in the next pandemic, especially at the outset, then you want a longer range on your radar. That's it. It's just like if there was an asymptomatic out here, like distance 8 from you, and it never got tested, that's fine, because by the time that becomes a problem for you, that case has blown up into a bunch of cases, which finally somebody shows up on the radar at some point, because it's just blowing up more and more, and it'll show up and you'll get to see that there's something coming out. And in general, the less reliable the testing is, just the longer range you want to put on your radar. Okay, now, quick things, people did talk about privacy. We actually designed this thing so that it doesn't need any personal information because I'm not interested in selling any advertisements. It's just when you install the app, you get a user ID. User ID is random. Basically, the concept was, look, there are all these other apps out there that people give all kinds of personal information to so that they can sell you ads. Wouldn't it be nice if there was some people who try to do something like this, are actually network theorists, and try to do this to actually control disease? So in a nutshell, we can talk more about these things later, but the most important piece is no GPS is needed, no contact list is needed, only short-range interphone communication by Bluetooth. That's what we're using. And another thing is like, does it actually work? Yeah, we found out that it works. And one of the fun parts is that we found out that it robustly works with some network theoretic boosts in the sense that this is a screenshot from what happened at Georgia Tech. So Georgia Tech is a place that deployed this first. And somebody posted on Reddit, very excited that they have 1,000 people connected to them using this app. The way to read this chart is it's telling you how many people at various distances from you are using the app. The font's small, but the key is you see there's like a, what is it? It's like a 2. This person's around 2 other people using the app. Those 2 are around 3 other people using the app. The way this works is as soon as our app reaches an R0 of virality of about 2 or 3, yes, our app is a viral app to fight a virus spreading on the same network that the virus spreads. As soon as our R0 is 2 or 3, then actually it blows up and it connects across this network. And practically speaking, I could go into the network theory there. We already had predicted at around 10% of a university community, you'll see this picture, which is what happened. And then that catalyzes more adoption as people say, look at that. All these other people are actually using this app. And finally, why is this interesting for this community? Well, it could be cool because, we actually are building this whole network-based system, and we are getting information of even like not who, but people getting vaccinated, what kind of vaccine, how they're connected to each other, infections coming in. We did this because we want there to be at least one entity in this world which can answer the question of how are the vaccines doing in real time against the variants in real time. It was sad that we couldn't think of anyone else who could do this. So we said, well, if we make an app for which people actually want it because it helps protect them, and then we can use this information to answer these deep questions, then we could actually hopefully bring this pandemic under control and also show people how to handle the next one. And to sum up, I know I talked too fast, but the time was too short. I wanted to emphasize what we've just done here is we've just taken the concept of radar, and it transforms all warfare, actually. But nobody had ever brought the concept of radar before to a pandemic in the context of using the network. And I'm very happy to talk to this EA community because this is actually a practical project that we can do something about right now. My biggest need is during the COVID pandemic, this is the ideal chance to let the whole world know and start to use a new system, familiarize with a new system that they could hopefully by the next pandemic demand that they want as soon as possible. Right? How do you control the next pandemic? You have to have education. How do you educate? You need a fire drill. What's the fire drill? COVID. And what we have here is we have a technique that could have major impact on future pandemics. And we need to use the time we have right now with COVID practically to roll this thing out as widely as possible. If you know people who might be connected to places that we can deploy, or if you're interested in working with us, actually, this is a directly applicable and practical project that we're very, very happy to work with the EA community on. With that, I'm going to stop this part and move into QA, perhaps, moderated by our host.
Thank you so much, Dr. Loh, for that wonderful presentation. I know we only have a couple of minutes left, but there's some very interesting questions. I think a couple of different people have asked about what how asymptomatic individuals are sort of accounted for within this system, if you want to comment on that briefly.
Yes. So the key is that we are assuming that they're asymptomatic individuals. That's why we built a system to use the network. Because if you have asymptomatic individuals, nobody can detect them. But if you have a network, you can start to realize that, well, even though that person was asymptomatic, how much of a danger is that to me anyway? It becomes more of a danger as that person spreads to more people. And some of those will show up on my radar. So the point is, unfortunately, asymptomatic is a reality. And we have to make sure that we have systems that can handle that. And the answer is longer range on the radar.
And it seems like you've spoken a little bit about preventative, this being potentially used as a preventative measure for the next pandemic. How do we make sure that it's like being used in the downtime, and how do we like actually make that a reality rather than just being an emergency response to, oh, like a lot of people are dying?
So the great thing about this is we now know from experimental evidence that if a community starts to use it, within 1 to 2 weeks, this very robust network springs up. That's the important thing. It's because we built the whole thing with this human incentives in mind. So that's why on the app's screen, it tells you here are how many people in your network that are using it. That's because we actually knew from the theoretical graph theory that it's called random graph theory, but we knew that after you reach about 5–10% of certain dense populations, then everyone would be like, oh my gosh, it looks like thousands of people are using it. And then that would catalyze another round of adoption. So my point is, this does not need to be sitting on everyone's phone for years. It actually only needs to be that people say, oh, I would like this now. Okay, download it now. And then boom, the network appears.
That's good to hear. And I guess two more questions. One pertaining to how do you see this sort of interfacing with manual contact tracing that's being conducted right now? I think you mentioned like it's a way to be able to quarantine contacts of contacts, which is currently not possible within.
Yeah, so the way that this interfaces with manual contact tracing is it makes manual contact tracing even more powerful. This is not attempting to replace manual contact tracing by any means. Contact tracing is a technique to find out who might be sick and remove them from society. This is a technique to tell everybody how the sickness is approaching them, assuming that they're not sick. You see, it's a very, very different paradigm. And that's why these two are complementary. Now, how they work together is that once the manual contact tracing happens for each sick person, we find out that there's like 5 other people who have been around them. We find out there are 5 other people around them or something, and all of them have the chance to enter the signal into this system. My point is the manual contact tracing does the job of signal boosting so that the fraction of altruistic people can actually participate. As one precise example, it might be that the sick person doesn't have the app installed. There might be a correlation there. But if the sick person is around somebody else manually contact traced who does have the app installed, that person can enter. And that's how you can get information coming from outside the app to in.
Great. I think I'm just going to go ahead and ask one more question because I think it is very interesting. But do you think there's a relationship between population density and usefulness of this app? And how do you think the dynamics of this system might change in a more rural setting or with a different disease that maybe has different transmission characteristics?
So actually, I think that this would be amazingly powerful in rural settings. The reason is because the way that we form the network, we actually don't care about just meeting another person very briefly. What we really care about is there an extended, repeated interaction between people? And so what this would very effectively capture is people living with each other, working with each other, going to school together. It would actually very reliably form that network, which is what we call the superhighway along which infection would come. And now if you think about what happened in the United States, the rural communities were not hit very hard in March and April in many parts. So actually a lot of them thought there was no problem until it was too late because they had no radar to let them know it was coming in. If you had this kind of a radar, then the rural communities would have been able to see inbound, incoming. And at that point, if they took up the cautions, they might not have been hit as hard. So I'm actually saying that because of the stability of the network that is there in a rural community, this would actually be extraordinarily powerful. In a bigger city, it's still going to be useful. But I'm going to say that, it's not like it's not useful, but I'm actually going to emphasize that the rural community, people assume it wouldn't be as good, but actually it'll be really good. And where we're using it right now, we're actually using it in urban communities. So it seems okay there too.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I think, okay, so we are unfortunately out of time, but thank you so much, Dr. Loh, for that discussion on a very interesting piece of technology.
Thank you very much.